going on, y'all? Got a little bit of an update. Really just gonna go over like the future plans for treatment, which unfortunately aren't amazing. Not my favorite. But on the bright side, I am finally making a ton of blood over the course of the last week. Well, from Friday, I made an entire unit of blood. Just kind of a lot. Um, my doctors were, or I guess my one doctor seemed to be pretty impressed by that. And I've got Daisy, who is a beautiful little dog and is adjusting pretty well to living in the co-op, which is really nice. But yeah, been making a ton of blood. I finally have more blood than I've had since December, which is, frustrating and great. I'm glad that I finally am able to, walk up the stairs without passing out or anything. That's always a plus, I'm sure. But yeah, so moving on to the treatment plan. What they're gonna do is kind of counterintuitive. We know outpatient treatment, it just doesn't work for me. Unfortunately, the only real option was the V squared regimen, which I'd already tried and just didn't work at all. I had to go to the hospital. So we know that one doesn't work. And unfortunately, since it took so long for my bone marrow to come back the last time, it's looking like inpatient hospital treatment also isn't an option. Since we're gonna try to rely on these donor cells to fight the actual leukemia, since that is the whole point of me having had the stem cell transplant in May. But a small but uncommunicated benefit of that is that you can actually test for the level of your donor cells versus the level of my own cells. And so what they saw before my leukemia came back is that they saw the donor cells start to go down on their own, and they were like, okay, we don't want to start treatment yet because we don't see any leukemia in your bone marrow, but this could be indicative of leukemia. But it could also just be, your donor cells just going down because they're, not in a great spot. And that just happens. Sometimes your bone marrow is just full of all the chemo and, they've been killed like 4-5 times, something like that, all of them. So, you could imagine there's just a bunch of toxic stuff in there still, that isn't really suitable for a lot of cell growth. But yeah, so they know now that since whenever my donor cells go down, that means that the AML level, which is my cancer, is starting to rise. And this is usually how they look out for leukemia starting, and that's why they were getting me they had 3 bone marrow biopsies in the course of a month because they kept looking they're like, why isn't anything here? This doesn't make any sense. Until they eventually found some. But now what they're going to do is they're going to look at these levels, the donor versus me, which unfortunately is a bone marrow biopsy. So got to get a chunk of my hip bone taken out every month or so, probably, as soon as my insurance goes through at least. And they're just going to look at the level of donor versus me. And when the level of the donor starts to go down, they're going to infuse me with donor cells outpatient. And so what that looks like is not another round of chemo, but is instead they're just going to have me go up to Dallas and then be like, all right, cool, we're just going to run it through an IV. And then I go home. So that's, that's nice. But it doesn't really inspire confidence that that's the only treatment plan besides another stem cell transplant. Because the next option, if the donor cell infusion doesn't work to get my level of cancer down, is they're looking at a second stem cell transplant. And that can either be with the same donor, which might not be the best idea because although I didn't get graft versus host, it didn't stop the cancer from coming back. So the other option is to get a second stem cell transplant with a different person. and that adds a third variable to the system. And at first it's like, oh, there's just three. Like, how big of a deal could that be? But it actually causes a lot of problems. So you see, like, in the first stem cell transplant, there was no donor two. It was just me and my donor. And so my donor could fight me, which is graft versus host, or I could fight my donor, which would just result in the stem cell transplant not taking, unfortunately, and it would just be my cells left. So it would just be kind of a waste of all the cells that were put inside me. Thankfully, neither of these really happen much, especially because graft versus host can kill you on its own, which is bad. But the thing with adding a third variable is that you get a ton more different interactions. For example, my donor, the second donor, can fight donor one, which actually wouldn't be too much of a problem, although it would contribute to adding, more toxicity in my bone marrow cells, making it a in-hospital environment for the second donor. Or it could attack my cells, which would again be graft versus host, and on top of the small level of graft versus host I have gotten from the first donor, a second version of graft versus host would be a terrible option. And so also, my cells can attack the donor, resulting in a stem cell transplant failure, where I would just either have donor one or myself left in the bone marrow, or you could have the donor one attack donor two, which would be the same thing, resulting in another failure. So you have all of these different options of attack, of bad options. So I really don't want a stem cell transplant again. That would be a not good option. Chemo is not fun, but a stem cell transplant where, the mortality rate is really high. And it's not a great thing to go through. And although there's been a lot of improvements in the last couple of years, it's still a really bad procedure that you just don't want. But yeah, that's the treatment plan. I spent so long thinking of how to explain everything, because I just don't like giving bad news on a little YouTube channel. Because I genuinely am doing really good. It's just that if something bad does happen, I don't have very many options, unfortunately. And I guess that's just how cancer works, right? Unfortunately. But yeah, still hitting the grind. I've got 5-pound dumbbells, and unfortunately I've somehow sprained both my wrists. They're not bad or anything. It's just uncomfortable to hold the 5-pound dumbbells, and I have gotten too many injuries to neglect that. But yeah, it's been going really well. I feel really good. I don't have all the energy I've ever had or whatever, but I'm still slightly anemic, so I'm sure once my blood levels come back, I'll be much more energized and everything. I'm gonna have to drop one of my classes, unfortunately, but other than that, things are going pretty well, I think.